Hello, I'm Steve, also known as T-Break Knitter on social media. In this tutorial, I want to show you how to interpret charts that are often used for stranded or Intarsia colour work. So, this is what I think about when I see a chart and I'm working with it. Before I show you how I interpret and use charts for colour work, there's just a couple of things I want to say about charts for knitting in general. The first point is that the purpose of a chart is to give you a visual impression of how that knitting is going to be knit and how it's going to look when the final fabric is made. And so you can see on this chart, you can see the basic shapes that are going to be formed by the stitches. And so it's useful to remember that what you're looking at is a picture, it might be simplified, of what your knitting is going to look like when it's finished. And that should help you remember some of the basics of a chart. Charts are numbered up the side for each of the rows if you're knitting flat, or rounds if you're knitting in the round. And you will often have the numbers repeated up the sides here. If you're knitting flat, you might find odd numbers on the right hand side of the chart and even numbers on the left hand side of the chart. That will be to remind you that when you're on an odd number, you'll be working away in stitches along in that order, and when working flat, you'll be working back along the row in the other direction, because when you're knitting flat and you're knitting from your left needle to the right needle, then the first stitches you do will actually appear on the right hand side of the fabric, and the last stitches of that round will appear on the left hand side of the fabric if you're working on the front side of the fabric on the outside of the fabric. On the return, typically a purl row, you'll actually be starting at the opposite side. You'll be starting on the side that when the fabric's finished will be the right hand side, the left hand side of the fabric, and so you need to work your way across the chart in the other direction. So knitting flat, you work one way, then the other, then the other, then the other, and that's why in many charts you'll see the odd numbers written on the right hand side and the even rows numbered on the left hand side to remind you which side of the chart you've got to start. If you're knitting in the round, you always go from right to left, because you're just keeping going knitting in the same direction. You don't reverse knitting the direction of knitting when you're working in the round, so you don't reverse the direction on the chart. And that's something that's very important to bear in mind, and a lot of people when they start knitting with charts can be confused about which way you're knitting. These columns are also numbered, and that's the stitch into the repeat pattern. It's not necessarily the same as number as a stitch in the row. So that's basic information about all charts used for knitting. And that's the basic difference between reading them in the round, where you're always going right to left, and where you're knitting in the flat, where you're going from a right side row to a wrong side row, so going from left to right, from right to left, then left to right. It's just like remembering that you've got to knit. If you're in stockinette, you knit on the outside and purl on the inside of your fabric. So that's a generic bit about knitting with charts. I'll now talk a bit about knitting with colour and charts. This is a style of chart that is often used in stranded knitting. It's very clear and it's very easy to reproduce in black and white. It's also very useful if you're not good at distinguishing between different colours. So in the chart area, these are various rounds from 1 to 20, and these will repeat several times as you work your way up the project, and across the way you've got the various stitches, and in almost every project these will repeat as you go round. The X represents a colour in the motif colour, this column here, and the blank represents a background colour. And in the pattern it'll tell you what motif colour to use for each of those rounds and which background colour to use for each of those rounds. There's no indication on the chart itself of where those changes take place, so you need to have a system reminding yourself when you need to change colour. There are other ways of representing information on the chart, and here's another example, perhaps a bit more obvious. In this, the grid, as before, shows you which colour to knit in, but here the colours are represented by the shading of each square. So you've got light green, dark green, blue, red, and each of those there will be a key to tell you which colour each coloured square represents. And here I've just recoloured the monochrome one. This is quite easy to read if you're using a few colours. However, if you're using many different colours, 7, 8, 9, 10 colours, you won't get enough contrast in the pattern to be able to put in a close representative of the yarn you're using into the colour pattern, and you'll find that the patterns not only have colours on but also have different styles of shading to help you distinguish between them. And of course the colour in the chart doesn't necessarily correspond to being the same colour in the yarn. This may happen with a designer publishing a pattern, but it will almost certainly happen if you choose to change the colour scheme of the item you're patting. Then you'll need to remember that a red square represents a white yarn, for example. So this is the principle you're using. Each square represents the colour. So let's go back to the monochrome one. Many fair art patterns change the motif and background yarns as you go up. As you can see here in this pattern, there's 3 colour A, 3 colour B, 3 colour C, 3 colour B, 3 colour A, 3 colour B, etc. And these repeat as you go up. So if you have more than 20 rows, then you go back from row 20, it's around 1 when you reach that stage. Similarly, almost every project has more stitches in a round than you have stitches shown in the chart, and in that case you go from 1 to 20, 1 to 20, 1 to 20, just repeating them round as they go. Now when you're knitting this yourself, you're going to need to remember when to change your motif colour and when to change your background colour. And the method I use to do this is to actually mark up the chart like this. So what I've done here is I've highlighted between the various rounds when I've got to change one of the colours. So I've used the convention on this that a red line means I'm changing the motif colour, and the green line means I'm changing the background colour. In this chart they don't both change at the same time, but that thick line there I use to tell me look and see what colours you've got to change. It's a way of reminding me. So that's the first thing I do to make it simple to use. The other thing that you've got to work out is where you start in the chart. If your pattern is for only one size, then you would normally be starting at column 1, going through to 20 and going through like that. But as soon as you get any shaping, you then start to run into the issue of where you start in the pattern. And if your patterns are multiple sizes, you'll often find that some of the sizes start at column 1, others might start at column 10, depending on the size. So you'll want to put on markings of where you need to start. So, for example, I might want to put a mark there to show that in my size I'm actually starting in column 6 every time I start a new round. And similarly, you may not start at the first row in the chart as you start your knitting. Some sizes of the pattern might, others might not. So you might want to mark on the chart where it is that you are going to be starting, and perhaps also mark where you're finishing in the chart, both up and down and as you work your way around the round. So it's your chart, your copy. You can mark it up in ways that are useful to you. And of course, you can mark up the colour chart in exactly the same way. And here I've still got those colour boundaries. They don't necessarily show up as well, but just there as a reminder of saying, hey, you've got to change your colours. Because even as you're working your way up, you may not notice that you've changed colours. Unbelievable as it seems, you may not notice while you're knitting, because you get so into the pattern you forget how to do these things. So that's the basic way I use the pattern. Next thing is, how on earth do you remember where you are in the pattern? And that's where I use a board. I either use a magnetic board like this one that I can put markers onto, or if I'm travelling and more likely to knock things because the magnets can move, I tend to use a clipboard, and on the back of here put a transparent sticky label on to show where I'm up to. Now, how do I show where I'm up to? I'll come back to the monochrome one because it's less fussy and so easier to see, and I will hold that steady on the board with a few magnets. And of course the board's on the slope, so it keeps slipping. So I've got this transparent magnetic marker. So if I am about to start working row 8, I'll put the marker on so that it is showing me row 8. Of course this is transparent, I can also see the rows that are coming up, but they're not as important as seeing the row that I'm knitting and the rows that came before it. And I'll explain why these are important. First of all, it should be obvious to why I need to show the row that I'm knitting. Of course, I've got to remember that's where I am on the cut chart. But it's important to see the row below, because that will help you avoid making mistakes. Because as I'm coming across here, I could just count 1 motif, 3 background, 4 motif, 3 background, 4 motif. What comes next? Where am I? Is that 4 motifs or that 4 motifs? You can then look at the row below you, and you can make sure that your 4 motifs there are covering a background, two motifs, and a background underneath, and the same there, so that you can check that you've not missed out a stitch, put in an extra stitch. So by being able to look back a row as you're knitting on, you can check that you haven't lost your place and that you're still matching up the pattern. So moving up the marker, either the magnetic marker on a magnetic board or a transparent sticky marker, if you're not using a magnetic board, that will show you which row you're working on. But both the marker, the transparent magnetic marker and the transparent sticking marker, can fall off. So when I'm working on a pattern, I will often just do a check against each of the rows I'm going up, and each time you do a row, I'll add a check to it and then use the bar gate marker so that you can see easily which row you're on next. Of course, many patterns will repeat many times as you go up. And of course, the one advantage of remembering to mark it in pencil on the side is that if you do move your marker, grandchildren, pets, move the marker, then you can find where you are again. Another way of helping you remember where you are is to use a row counter. And because we're knitting in the round, the row counter won't fit neatly onto your needle. It'll push the stitches apart, so you don't want to do that. So I just tie mine onto a piece of yarn and put that at the start of the round. So as I move through the knitting, I come across this strand of yarn. I know I'm at the start of another round, and I can advance the counter so I know how many rows I've done. It's also useful to count so that you're counting where you are on the chart rather than necessarily the number of rows, because it's where you are on the chart that's the important thing. How many times you've been through the chart is quite easy to count. So that's how I can remember where I am. Bit of belt and braces approach, use two methods of counting. You definitely need a row marker on the chart so you can see where you are on the chart, and you can either keep a record of where you are by writing in pencil on the chart, or you can use a stitch counter, or of course you could use all three methods. So that's the basics of how I use the chart when I'm knitting a fair isle pattern. That's how I use charts when I'm doing colour work. I hope you found this useful. Till the next time, happy knitting!